Good morning. Welcome to the KPMG webinar on the Global Internal Audit Standards, coming to you live from both Dublin and London. Today we're going to step through some of the key changes in the 2024 standards, and more importantly, we're going to focus on what those key changes practically mean for you. We've had an unbelievable response to today's webinar, with hundreds of people tuned in across both the UK and Ireland. That shows to me that there's a keen interest across our profession to understand and apply these new standards. So kudos to the Institute of Internal Audit for these new standards. There's been some great changes up front in them. There's more of a link for you in our profession to the strategies of our organizations. There's more of an input for us to have conversations with the senior management. And equally, they've taken on board over 19,000 individual pieces of feedback from members like us. If you're lucky enough, as I was, to read through both the draft and final standards in detail, you'll have noticed quite a big shift between the draft standards and the final standards. A lot of the draft standards had must statements. In the finals, they've now moved into the consideration for implementation with a should or may beside them. Today we're going to be monitoring the Q&A coming through, so please do, if you have any questions at all, send them in. I'd love to get a few very difficult ones to try and stump some of my panelists today, so absolutely go for it. I've got a big board over to my left here. It's going to be teaming up the questions coming through, and if there's anything that's kind of repetitive, we'll absolutely look to bring that into the conversation today. I'm delighted to say I'm joined in studio today by two of my Irish-based colleagues, Paul Carroll, who's a director in the risk consulting practice here in Dublin, and Maria McInerney, who's our internal audit guru locally here in Ireland. Also via web link from the UK, Rob Pope, who's a director in the practice over in London, and equally all things internal audit, Rob's an expert on. So like most of you joined in today, we've all worked in internal audit departments in organizations. We appreciate what you want today are practical things, not for us to all be talking to each other about how great we think we are, real live examples of how you can help implement these in your job. So the plan today at a very high level, we're going to step through the structural changes. We're then going to go domain 1 through domain 5, and then at the end I'm going to ask each of my panelists to wrap up with a thematic observation of things that maybe permutate through each of the domains. As a kind of set the scene, stand back, the Institute of Internal Audit released these standards on January 9th, 2024. There is a 1-year transition period, so they go into effect January 9th, 2025. If you are lucky enough to have a EQA at any stage before January 9th, 2025, you will be assessed against the 2017 standards. For me, the difference between the standards isn't that great, but what you will note within them is an increased rigor within the 2024 standards. This is just meant to try and raise the bar a bit for the internal audit profession, and it makes sense for things like this where an institute will put out once in a decade change. It's really just trying to catch up and move the profession on a bit further. So before we get into domain 1, I might ask Maria, if okay, just to step us through the structural changes between the 2017 and 2024 standards. And I believe we even have a fantastic visual to put up on screen for this, Maria.
Yeah, of course. So hopefully you can all see the visual now. It should be shared there on screen with yourselves. So just at that very high level, hopefully you can be able to get that from the graphic, that there's 3 components really to the new 2024 standards. 2 of these components are actually mandatory, so that is the Global Internal Audit Standards for 2024 and the topical requirements, which we'll touch on a little bit later, probably we'll discuss a little bit later in the webinar. And then the supplementary global guidance that also will be issued. So on that, generally the guidance, this is something that we've seen before. The IAA tend to issue this sort of guidance material and supplementary information on certain topics. They'll do it every now and again. So this is something they've been doing for a while, and they're just going to continue to do this. But the main thing is the Global Internal Audit Standards. So what they are is that they've actually taken the 2017 International Professional Practice Framework, and there was 5 main components in the 2017 framework. They were namely the mission, definition, the core principles, code of ethics, and then the standard themselves. So what they've actually done is they've unified it all into just one document, just to make it a little bit easier to navigate and to work through. And the actual 2024 standards then are broken up then into 5 main sections, and these are called domains. So the first domain is the purpose of internal auditing. The second is ethics and professionalism. Then there is governing internal audit, managing internal audit, and then the provision of internal audit services. So they're the 5 main domains, and then across each of the 5 domains are broken down into 15 principles and 52 standards then. So when you're reading through the document, it is quite a meaty document that we all know. We've all had to sit through and read through the 120-page document. But they're broken up, each of the standards, into 3 sections. So you have your main requirement at the start, and that's your golden Bible. That's what we're all looking to conform to. And then, as Colin mentioned, then there's the considerations for implementation. And we've seen that a lot of the stuff that they had included as musts in the proposed changes have actually then moved into implementation. So it's good to note this, and that is the bulk of the real standards. But it again, it's just considerations, it's best practice, and definitely, you know, a lot of the chief internal auditors and head of internal audit should be very much aware of the considerations, but it's your requirements is what we're all going to be held to and measured against for conformance. And then they also have included this year in the new update is the examples for conformance and evidence of conformance. So it's really explicit, and I think everybody can agree the 2017 framework was a little bit disjointed and fragmented and a little bit duplicative in areas depending on the 5 components, that there was information kind of in 2 places. So the whole idea is that all those 5 components are all in one place. It's much easier to navigate. It's much clearer on what exactly the Institute is expecting of internal audit and for best practice. So it's hopefully when you're going through it, although quite beefy, it is hopefully easier to follow.
Oh, that's fantastic. Appreciate that, Maria. I definitely know myself, I'd imagine the same for yourself, Paul and Rob. I found the old standards quite tricky with all the different docs, and every time I go to do an audit or reference to standards, I'd be looking for my implementation guide, can never find the bloody thing, always hard to figure out where to put it. So brilliant to see it all in one doc, slimmed down version, absolutely fantastic. Maria, you're on a fantastic role there. Do you want to take us through Domain 1 as well?
Yeah, so Domain 1, as I mentioned previously, is the purpose of internal auditing. So whilst, again, I was at the webinar that the IAD themselves did in January, and they were very clear in the fact that they're not reinventing the wheel here. The concept of internal audit is fundamentally the same. They're just, as you mentioned, bringing the standards up to date and what we expect and what we see in very mature internal audit functions. But they have provided a revised definition of the purpose. So you'll even see from the mapping document that the Institute issued on their website that the purpose, it hasn't really changed. It's been kind of punctuated throughout the 2017 standards. They've just put it in one place, which will then make it easier when you are communicating, which we'll cover in Domain 3 to improve governing, and when you're revising your IA strategy and mission, that you actually know what exactly the real purpose is. We all know why we're here, at least we hope we know why we're here. But the whole idea is to have just a revised definition, and they've really included language around advice, assurance, insight and foresight, which is really good to promote the actual value and purpose then of internal auditing. So it's all in one place. So there's no major requirement in Domain 1. It is good to have that for communication.
As you say, it is nice to know there's a purpose to what we do each day we come into work. So that's fantastic, and kudos to the Institute for putting that first. Domain 2 through 5 then, we get into quite kind of chunky material. That's really where the core, the standards are. Domain 2 is on ethics and professionalism. And if it's okay, Rob, I might start off with you on this one, maybe just to get, you know, again, the kind of the key changes within there and really how they're going to impact the chief internal auditors logged in today and the audit teams that are watching the webinar.
Yeah, no, sure. So thank you very much. So I think Domain 2 absolutely goes to the heart of integrity, objectivity, and then the maintaining confidentiality, and it cuts across 5 then underlying areas within the standards. There are some new standard requirements in this section, but also a number of points in the standards have been re-emphasised when you compare it against the 2017 version. I think it's fair to say that a number of internal audit functions were probably doing a majority of these standards already, particularly around continuing professional development. But I think it just goes to show that there's greater emphasis on a number of these particular areas. So in particular, I was just going to draw out a couple of areas and then just wrap up at the bottom. So the first one for me is around auditors exhibiting courage, communication, and then really making sure that they take appropriate action if they're met with a difficult situation. The second element was then around the chief audit executive maintaining a work environment where auditors continuously feel supported when expressing the results of the engagement, and whether this is either positive or negative. The third element was then around auditors maintaining and exercising professional skepticism and making sure that they continue to be inquisitive and seek to maintain and obtain additional evidence where needed to be able to support audit conclusions and opinions. I think then the fourth area, and the big difference from the 2017 to the current standards, is around then the knowledge, skill, and maintaining competence. I think this has particularly been really emphasised within the 23-24 standards, and I think again that's really important because it also links to making sure that the audit functions have appropriate financial resource and the budget available within the functions to be able to properly invest in training programs for auditors. So they're able to continue to maintain skill and competence as the evolving risk landscape of organisations continue to change. I think particularly the first 3 points around the courage, the professional skepticism, I think it all goes back to the organisational culture as well, and making sure that internal audit functions are able to successfully audit in an organisation where the function is seen as value adding and it's supporting the governance, risk and control environment of the organisation. But it also links back, and really importantly, to that professional competence and ensuring that auditors maintain the training and internal audit functions are effectively supporting internal auditors in this regard. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Appreciate that, Rob. And you're so right about the culture and that kind of leadership and tone from the top for the chief audit exec in there to set that out and make sure that their team does feel supported, has the right environment, and can challenge. It's a tricky job. We deal with a lot of very senior stakeholders. We come under a lot of pressure, and to be able to hold your line when you're right and not kind of buckle to things within the organisation. So absolutely agreed there. You touched on one other piece as well, which can be difficult for people to maintain when they're within internal audit teams for a long time, the professional skepticism. So I know myself, I would have worked in internal audit teams kind of 5-6 years at a time. And I might open up to all three panelists if anyone has any kind of thoughts on how would you go about, or any tricks to the trade in helping team members to maintain that professional skepticism and not become so familiar with your organization and the people within it that you start to maybe not go as far as in depth with some of your audits because you trust so and so and you know them, etc. So I don't know if anyone's ever come across any kind of good practices there to help the team members with that as they do their job.
I think it's the network that the internal auditors have, not just in your own organisation, but broader than their own organisation. I think the local institutes are really great at supporting from training events, but also helping with kind of networks as well. So effectively what you're getting as part of that network is contribution from other organisations. And I think that really helps then add value to the organisation that auditor is working at. But it also helps bring a different perspective and perhaps a different mechanism to be able to provide a layer of kind of soft benchmarking as well to risk and control of, I've heard organisation X talk about this particular area. I'm going to bring that knowledge and understanding to my organisation in terms of where I audit. And I think that's really, I think we see leading functions do that, and I think it's really important to maintain that competence, but also that skepticism that we're talking about.
Rob, one other I might just add very quickly as well, depending on the size of the function, is you can rotate people around within the kind of sub-teams in audit as well, so they face off against new stakeholders every so often. I might move on to domain 3. I'm just having a look at the Q&A board over here to my left, and this seems to be very, very much the hot topic area that people have a ton of questions on. So I'm going to apologise in advance, Paul, but I was going to hand over to you first, if okay, on this one, and I'll take the first question off the board, which is on Principle 6, so quite nice to segue into Domain 3. What is the difference between the mandate and charter outlined in Domain 3?
Yeah, thanks, Colin, and hello to everybody that's joining us. So I think the key part here to see is the mandate isn't really creating anything new. The content of the mandate was probably captured in most internal audit charters already, but what it does is it's a requirement on the chief audit executive to really get that authority from the board documented down into a paper that the board approves and says this is now internal audit functions mandate or authority, what their roles and responsibilities are going to be, what services they're going to provide, and really help them to achieve that purpose of internal auditing. That's the key part of the mandate. The internal audit charter is, again, it builds on that. It's not, you can't really talk about the two independently too much, but the internal audit charter builds on that and goes further on what are the objectives of the internal audit function, what standards they're going to comply with, whether that be local laws and regulations, as well as obviously the global IIA standards, and anything further, things like for larger teams, if it's across jurisdictions, how that jurisdictional setup is configured, what portfolios maybe are split up between the teams, how that's set up, and also then things like reporting requirements to the board, the frequency of those, what internal audit artifacts really require a board approval, that stamp. So that they're the key pieces of, I suppose, the differentiators between the two.
No, appreciate that, and I think it's probably fair to say for those difficult stakeholders, when you turn up and they tell you you're not allowed access to X, Y, and Z, or you don't have the authority. So the mandate in the charter, these are the docs then that we would have that give us that authority to say, well, actually we have access across the board to what we need to do.
Exactly right. No, you're spot on, and that's a really, really key part of these new standards. In that, as anybody who's read them will see, that this section in particular creates the essential conditions that supplement the requirements, and actually puts an onus on the chief audit executive and the internal audit function, but it also says, hey, the organization needs to be set up to support the internal audit function, that the board gives the authority, but also the senior management and the executive management have a role in supporting the internal audit functions, promoting them, and making sure that recognition and that authority that the board has given the internal audit function is, I suppose, spread out through the organization as a whole.
Yeah, absolutely, and the essential conditions are the new piece then in the 2024 standards to talk about the role of the board and the role of the senior management. But if I remember this correctly, it places the onus on the chief audit exec to go to the board and go to the senior management to explain to them what their authority is, and then if there's a disagreement or an ability where we can't actually fully execute those, again, the onus is on the chief audit exec to document that down as well.
Exactly right. So this is kind of, you're naturally going into then the point of independence there. So obviously Principle 6 talks about the board and the senior management supporting the internal audit function, but the internal audit function is an independent function, and it has to have that organizational independence structure there to support it in that regard. Often, particularly non-FS organizations, we find that internal audit functions do other non-audit, the chief audit executive is responsible for non-audit like responsibilities or risk, exactly, like they kind of perform that second line and third line function. And while that's not in itself against the standards, what it says is that the internal audit function needs to make the board aware that conflict or that potential impairment of independence when it comes to those non-audit responsibilities, that gets acknowledged by the board, and also that senior management and the board work with the internal audit function and the chief audit executive to try and put in safeguards that, I suppose, to try and minimise any impairment of the independence.
No, it's fantastic, because I do see the board again. Another one of the kind of key themes coming through here was all around independence and with those essential conditions. But I think you've covered that off absolutely fantastically. I think is the last part then of domain 3 all about the oversight of the board, and presumably again with those essential conditions we've now got kind of more things clearly mandated to the board, but my gut would probably be telling me that the oversight of the board is quite a well-trodden path for us in internal audit, but the new requirements around the senior management are potentially some new areas. So maybe to touch on Principle 8 be fantastic, if okay, Paul.
Yeah, absolutely. And it kind of, to be honest with you, Domain 3, while they're split out in 3 separate principles, they kind of naturally bleed together quite a lot. So even at the end of Principle 7, there is a piece there where the Chief Audit Executive is actually supposed to inform the board on what qualifications and competencies a Chief Audit Executive requires. That is something, that is something that is bespoke to each business, to be honest, because depending on what industry you're in, the knowledge of the industry is going to be very key to knowing the risks that apply to the organisation. So that is something that is in Principle 7 around the organisational independence. But then going into oversight of the internal audit function from either the board or senior management, it talks to how they are naturally need to be informed, that the Chief Audit Executive is responsible for informing them on how to oversight and what is required to do that, but also in terms of the internal quality assessment, whether that the standards say that's required on at least an annual basis, and the external quality assessment on at least a 5-yearly basis. It actually talks to saying that, hey, senior management need to be involved in that. They need to have input into how the performance is assessed, need to have input into remediating actions and supporting the internal audit function and addressing any actions coming out of those quality assessments. So it's really bringing internal audit, that it's not a standalone function in the organisation anymore.
Great.
The organisation needs to be set up to support the internal audit function, both at a senior management level and at the board level.
No, absolutely fantastic. And you're absolutely spot on. Like, at the end of the day, we're independent function within an organisation, but we're all in the same boat. We're all trying to head the same direction, so we should be there to support each other. So that's, I think, as I say, the majority of questions were coming through on Domain 3, but you've covered that off fantastically, Paul, so I really do appreciate that. I might step through then, just in the interest of time, into Domain 4. So Domain 4 is all about managing the internal audit function. And if it's okay, Rob, I might start with yourself again on this one, just again around the kind of key changes that we would have seen come through in Domain 4 versus the 2017 standards.
Yeah, no, sure. So I think particularly Domain 4, where they're talking about the principles around planning strategically, and then Principle 10, where it's talking about managing resources. I think these areas are, again, areas where there's some re-emphasis on certain topics, but there's also clearly some new areas as part of it as well. So Principle 9 is all around the implementation of the internal audit strategy, implementation of the audit methodologies, and then the development of the internal audit plan. And then how does the internal audit function then work with both internal and external providers of assurance as well? So kind of going more into that coordination, assurance mapping type approach. And then Principle 10 then talks about the development of the internal audit budget, and then making sure, again, similar to the one that we spoke about earlier, there's budget there to be able to recruit, develop, and retain staff as well. Because I think, again, that's really important. The retention of knowledge and skill set with internal audit function, I think, should be a priority for functions. And then the last area of Principle 10 is then around the technology and thinking about both data analytics, but also what the function is using from a audit management software and solution as well.
Oh,
I think
good,
just, so I was just going to say, just in terms of the last bit around internal audit strategy, again, I think that bit, I think, continues to be really important for internal audit functions, particularly in the context of just making sure that there's a strategy, there's a clear path over the next couple of years in terms of where you're thinking about strategically, where do you want the internal audit functions to go. And I think that is absolutely everything around what is the function doing around like data analytics, AI, thinking about kind of training of staff as well.
No, 100%. And you're spot on. I sometimes find with internal audit we're great at going out to other parts of the business to say, show us your strategy, show us your 5-year plan. We don't always necessarily do it as well ourselves, which is probably a common theme from life. And the other bit you're talking about there, Rob, on the technology, absolutely spot on. Like that is something, and I know we're going to get the kind of thematics after Domain 5, but that permutates all through the new standards. Like there is a full realization there that the world is moving, the world is changing, technology is key. Whether it's going to bring efficiencies, better kind of workflows, control paths, whatever it be, but you really, really have to be thinking about technology, the new tools that are out there. You as a chief audit exec have a responsibility to keep abreast of what is in the market. Like data analytics, yes, of course we can do it in Excel, but there'll be potentially other tools out there that can do more for you within your function. So absolutely 100% agree to there, Rob, on all of that. I don't know, Paul or Maria, if anything else to add on Domain 4 of managing the internal audit function?
One area, and myself and Rob were talking about this previously, was in preparation for this, was actually around the standards speak to integrated assurance for the first time. Previously, the old standards, it gave a should try and use the internal assurance providers and external assurance providers to make sure there's no duplication of effort. Now it actually goes down to the definition that it's a must. Yeah. You must try and you must work with your internal and external assurance providers. And it goes even further to say that if for any reason you can't, as in the chief audit executive, if for any reason that you can't deliver on that integrated assurance, initiative, you actually need to highlight to senior management what the blockers are. And that's a very key piece, especially now in this cost reduction environment that we're all in, where there's such a laser focus on costs and saying, okay, how can internal audit still be effective, be efficient, optimize their approach, that piece of it. The standards really speak to that quite well, and there's a lot more in the standards about resourcing than in the 2017 standards.
Yeah, no, look, I have to say it's been something that's irked me over the years, integrated assurance, and the fact that more companies don't do it, and this infighting that you get between first, second and third line and stuff around, who's going to do what and all this kind of stuff that goes on with it. But fundamentally it adds so much to your organization, and I'm delighted to see that the new standards are going to force the chief audit exec out there to talk to every single person in the organization who has an assurance piece that we can rely on. And it doesn't say we have to rely on it, but we have to get out there and at least understand what's being done. I know myself from my own experience of going around to boards and audit and risk committees, etc., an assurance map that sets out what is done across the first, second and third line is so invaluable to an organization. If you're on an audit committee and you're responsible for the overall control environment of a company, to get that given to you on one page that shows you everything that's happening is fantastic. I also know from other companies I would have worked in, when the regulator comes in to be able to produce that document of integrated assurance, one, it shows a joint up thinking, but equally for them it gives them comfort that things are being done across the organization. We're all aiming in the same direction. So again, I think they're another fantastic addition in the 2024 standards. So that's fantastic. The last one then we have is Domain 5, which is performing internal audit services. I am conscious I've put all the kind of heavy lifting onto the panel so far for the work today, so I can start us off on this one before I pass over to the panel members. For me, this is very much what it says in the tin. This is our day in, day out activity, our planning, our execution, our reporting. For me, the 2024 standards here versus 2017 plus implementation guides, there's less to read in 2024, which is fantastic. Always great if we've got less that we have to comply with. But in addition to that, another fantastic thing in it, they haven't materially changed. So less to read and not huge differences within it. And in saying that, of course, there's a few bits and bobs in there that I'll run through. There's a few items that have moved from what are current good practice, and these have now moved into requirements within the 2024 standards. The first one, which is something I personally love to do anyway, so again, I'm delighted to see this come through as a must in the standards, is root cause analysis on engagement findings. So before, I would have seen a lot of internal audit functions try this as good practice, but equally a lot of internal audit functions that don't look at this. We now have a requirement to work collaboratively with management to try and find the root cause of the findings that we're bringing up in audit reports. As with all great things in life, there is a get out of jail free card at the end of this, in brackets, when possible. Now for me, again, if I think back to my time in London, working in kind of high performing internal audit teams over there, we used to have a 3-pronged rating scale, high, medium, low for findings. If my team were coming to me with highs and they didn't have root cause done, I would not be happy. I would have a full-on expectation on highs, get to the root cause. On mediums, I would have a very, very strong preference to get to a root cause, and I wouldn't really be accepting the "it wasn't possible this time" column. And on lows, look, I align with the Institute here. When possible sounds great. I wouldn't be losing too much sleep over that. So look, on root cause analysis, a fantastic thing to do. Another kind of side piece on that, not to kind of digress too much, but for me, when I brought root cause analysis up to the audit committee every 6 months or a year, we kind of collate the various root causes across all the findings that we had in various audit reports. The amount of discussion this would get at audit committee was incredible. People loved it, and not just the audit committee, but the senior management. And if we're going to be working a lot closer with them now as part of 2024 standards, this is something they want to see. This is a good news story. This is something of interest to these people. So again, delighted to see that that's brought into the new standards. The next one, which I find quite funny now before I get into it, but another good practice moved into requirements. For anyone who's ever had a disagreement with management over a finding, recommendation or action plan, which is every single person logged into the webinar today, and if you haven't, drop us in a Q&A there. We'd love to hear about where you work. But for the other 99% of us, we've all had this, right, to disagree with management on these things. You now have to have a methodology, which means you've got to have a documented methodology, which means it needs to be documented by the chief audit exec or his team. The onus falls on us for this, not management. And this has to give kind of a route or ability to both management and internal audit to voice their opinion and rationale as to why they disagree on this. Now again, my take from knowing the majority of kind of companies that have logged in today, we all do this already in practice. It may not be the case that we all have it documented down within a methodology, but we've all been there, so there's clearly something within your company. I would see this as a one-pager just to add into your methodology slides. A couple of other kind of small ones that have come into this, again, going from the current good practice into the requirements now. As Maria would have touched on at the very start, we now have the advisory, which used to be consulting, versus the assurance engagements. In the whole of the round, you now need to work to pretty much the same level across both of these. There's a few differences within the standards where you do a little bit less for advisory, and again the caveats in there with, you know, subject to agreement with the people you're doing the review for. A couple of these crop up in domain 5, identification of evaluation criteria and gathering evidence to develop findings. So you may not need to do both of those things, which is a bit of a time save if possible when it comes around to the advisory engagements. And then another one, which I would think every single person logged in today already does, your internal audit reports, they have to list out the person responsible for the finding, and equally they have to have the target date against when it's going to be completed. And then the very final one, just before I opened up for comments from the panel on this, is report and finding ratings. So in the 2017 standards, there's no requirement to have a report or finding rating. It's actually the same in the 2024 standards. Again, you don't have to have it. Now, I would again think every single person logged in here probably has both. If not both, definitely would rate on the findings. But what 2024 does introduce, which again, I don't think is a big change for us, is you have to have a conclusion now, an overall conclusion within your report, and your individual findings need to be stacked in order of, you know, the biggest impact to the least impact. If it was me, if I was sitting in a head of audit role within an organization, I would just use ratings, far easier than trying to go through all that kind of stuff for me. But I don't know from the panel on all the stuff we've just run through there in domain 5, if there's any other kind of pieces to add into that, or anything in there that kind of sounds reasonable enough or unreasonable enough for the institute to have put in.
Yeah, no, I kind of agree with everything you've said there, Colin, but like also in the considerations for implementation, they are quite explicit as well. I know they're not obviously requirements, even off the top of my head. I know that they spit out even work papers, what you should be included even in your work paper. So it's very explanatory, like it makes very much a lot of sense, and like actually quite helpful, I think, for quite immature and new internal audit functions that are forming, like, and even in Principle 9, it calls out methodologies, exactly what you should be implementing in the considerations for implementation. It's not a requirement, but it's very, very clear guidance on what the function should be including. But generally, as you said there, Colin, like they're not reinventing the wheel, we're still performing audits, and even some of the things that they included, I was surprised for even in the requirements, because I assumed they were already there. I was shocked to see there were changes, because we've seen it so often with all our clients. But yeah, no, absolutely. It's
kind of, which is probably only so many ways you can reinvent the wheel for executing an internal audit, all right. No, that's fantastic. Unless there's anything else from yourself, Rob or Paul, I'll move on to the thematic. Yep. No, fantastic. So I'm going to ask each of you, if okay, for maybe one or even two kind of thematic changes within the standards, things that would, you know, permutate down throughout each of the domains and maybe not be specific to any one, but kind of more in the whole of the round. And one additional thing, if okay, Maria, I might ask you to tag on to that as well. I'm conscious we haven't had a chance to run through the topical requirements yet. So do you mind if I start with yourself on topical requirements and on the thematic, and then move over to Paul after that, if okay?
Yeah, so the topical requirements are absolutely brand new. This is a new idea to the Global Internal Audit Standards. They are mandatory, so they are in addition to the standards that are already there, that we obviously have to conform with whatever the engagement that we're performing. But these are additional requirements that must be implemented in your engagement when you are performing engagement in that specific topical area. So they will cover certain topics that are quite pervasive in nature and tend to be much higher risk. So certain areas like ESG, third-party management, and cybersecurity. So topics like that, they'll come up as the emerging risks are coming, and they'll cover those. And those requirements must be covered then in those engagements. But it's also really important to note that they're not a directive to internal audits to immediately implement them on their internal audit plans. So it's only an if and when. So when you're going to cover these risks, please also do these requirements. They're not in addition. So I think the idea is that they sit alongside the timeless global standards, and then they have these timely additional requirements. It's to kind of give consistency across the board globally in internal audit functions, that we're all kind of singing off the one hymn sheet when we're doing these more ad hoc reviews. And they've actually also submitted their draft on cybersecurity online, and you can open for public comment now. So I think up until the 3rd of July, you can now have your say in what you think of them, or speak now, if ever hold your peace is the thought. But yeah.
And the timeless versus timely, is that a IIA, or you've coined it yourself?
No, I'm not going to claim that one. I'm very aware that there is somebody from the IIA on that. I pinched that from their webinar. I like that. I thought it was snappy. But yeah.
No, fantastic. Appreciate that. Maybe over to yourself, Paul, for any thematic that you would have seen come out of it.
And I'm actually seeing it's something that's coming up in the thematic questions even, is the essential standards or the essential conditions. Does this mean more work or less work for internal audit, or what does it mean for internal audit and working with senior management? And really, I think it's more of a work smarter, not harder situation. Internal audit functions, if senior management are on the same page with us from the get-go, it makes life a lot less difficult for us. So it's something that when we can say, okay, hey, senior management, you signed up to and you had input to our charter, our strategy, our audit plan, you know what our targets and our objectives are for forthcoming 12 months, 2 years, 3 years, whatever the case may be. Senior management, like having everybody bought into that, makes friction a lot less, a lot less likely to occur. You will, understandably, friction may and probably will still occur depending on what internal auditors find, but this ongoing collaboration and stakeholder engagement, it's a key piece of the standards that I think is absolutely fantastic, that it's making sure internal audit is set up for success.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think back to that conversation we had earlier about the mandate and charter and, using that to kind of get the information we want out there. To your point, if we've already had their input into that mandate, into that charter, if they're with us, and again, we're all in the same boat, heading in the same direction, that does, without doubt, make life a whole lot easier. I might pass over to yourself, Rob, maybe for one final thematic, if okay.
Yeah, no, sure. So I think probably mine's similar to Paul's in the sense of not necessarily the senior management bit, but the reporting line to audit committee in terms of, I think, just re-emphasising within the standards the importance of that internal audit is independent, it's objective, and making sure that chief auditors are giving information to audit committee to be able to discharge their responsibilities, but also really think about how the audit committee can then also help the internal audit function in terms of that positioning within the organisation, the seniority of the chief auditor, making sure that you've got the right reporting line, but also then the kind of the sign off of resources, the budget, because I think that just helps with maintaining the position, and gives the financial resource and the financial mandate to the internal audit function to really make sure that they're set up for success, that they can act as a third line of defense within the organisation, and they can invest in things like fund things like technology, AI, data, and things like that, which I think just makes it a lot more exciting for internal audit functions to operate in.
Fantastic, really appreciate that, Rob. Well, look, the good news is we've had a fantastic conversation today, but that brings us to the end of the core part of today's webinar. Just want to say thank you all so much who have tuned in, for the great questions that have come up here on the board. Apologies, we could only get to a handful of them today, but good news, going forward we'll have more webinars and more in-person sessions with the team here. So for anyone in the Irish office here, anyone based out of Ireland, will be hosting in-person sessions and future webinars as well for the global audience into the UK. I might, if okay, just leave you with two kind of thoughts from myself just on the new standards. And the first one very much touches on what Rob just spoke about there. So often in the internal audit function, we have conversations with boards, chair of the audit committee, the CEO, the senior management, etc. But sometimes it can come across as a negative thing, right? We're bringing up big issues, you've got big findings in the big audit report, and the people on the other side of the desk probably only really hear things from us like that. These new standards are a good news story for your department, and I would absolutely think we should be trying to take full advantage of that in the conversations that we're having. So to Rob's point there, new technology. We've got the points Maria was talking about there on the topical requirements, cyber, ESG, cloud, etc. All very complex, specific things. This is all going to cost money, resourcing, time. So when you're having those conversations with the chair of your audit committee, the board CEO, absolutely try and take full advantage of them. Try and get out of that what you need for your department. And again, good news story. It's once in a decade these things change. It's a great foot in the door to open that conversation. And the second thing I might leave you with today, if okay, is we've had a fantastic conversation here today. We've gone through lots of the big changes in the standards. What do you need to do going away from today? Again, back to that piece on the strategy. Sometimes we're great at telling other functions to do things, but what's our kind of plan of action coming off here? So for me, I would start with, firstly, review your notes coming off today. Secondly, communicate those notes and things coming out of this webinar today with your team. The third thing I'd do, and this is incredibly important to do, a gap analysis of your current methodology against the 2024 standards. I'm currently doing this in lots of companies, and it's bringing up, things that need to be tweaked or changed or wholesale additions into the methodology. The clock is ticking on this. Before we know it, all of a sudden we'll be down into the second half of the year, and it gets just trickier to get things done. So the fourth thing I do after the gap analysis is I set an implementation plan then to, what's come out of the gap analysis, what do I need to change. I would then once again over-communicate with your team. They're the ones who are going to be using the methodology, doing the audits for you day in, day out. So make sure to over-communicate with them. 6, training on the back of all the changes for the people in your team. And 7, and most importantly, and linked again to what Rob was talking about there and Paul was talking about, you are going to have to sit down with your board and your senior management, explain to them there's new standards, and most importantly, the essential conditions that they now have to do as well with the internal audit team. So that'd be my kind of 7-step approach coming out today to make this real and kind of make it stick for you as well. So look, just to say, to all our Irish audience out there, we'll be attending the IIA conference on the 2nd of May, so look forward to seeing you there. And do connect with us all here on the panel today on LinkedIn, or come directly to the KPMG website. All our contact information is up there. We'd be delighted to share the insights that we have from the current gap analysis that we're performing, or those implementation plans that we're helping clients with at the moment. So just say thank you so much for tuning in today. It's been an absolute pleasure. Talk to you soon. Thanks, bye.